enjoy lunch. For the next 30 minutes, I'm going to give you an overview around the European Union regulation and also some of the regulation in the US, focusing on contaminants. So, what we generally define as contaminants, within a regulatory perspective, is substances that are not intentionally added into food, and they can have potentially toxic and negative effect on human health and sources. The variety could be natural sources, could be process, could be chemical contamination, package, could be transport, and so on. The European Union, within its regulation, it sets maximum limits for mycotoxins, metals, dioxins, PCBs, PAHs, 3-MCPDs, melamine, erucic acid, and nitrates. And also, it has a completely different regulation for pesticides, which we're going to cover. There's a generic cultural maybe or approach that is between the European Union and the US and how they define the regulation. And the basic difference is that within the European Union framework, for the substance to be able to be used, has to be proven not to be toxic. And this is how all the toxic assessment is taking place. For the US regulation, something can be approved as long as we don't have a toxic history for it. So it is completely different approach to risk that sometimes kind of leads to different timelines and different limits. In principle, in the European Union, there's a maximum levels are set for the contaminants of great concern following a toxicological assessment, and the levels are based on scientific evidence from within all the member countries and all the information they exchange. And for imported foodstuffs, the country of origin is solely responsible for compliance. In generic 4 steps on the EU framework, there's a strict import rules that they have to be respected by anyone who needs to export food there. The importer is responsible to comply with all the requirements on the products that are to be imported in the EU. The member states and a lot also local regions and local countries are responsible of the sampling, of the testing and the compliance checking of everything that's being imported in the borders and then exchanging information across member countries. And a significant difference in both the US framework is that there's no need for a broker or an agent. The contaminants regulations, everything excluding pesticides, they can be summarized within 2 regulations. There's a regulation that defining that the food has to be safe to be placed in the market, and it kind of sets the whole framework about how the contaminants levels are set and what the authorities do. And then you have the 1881-2006 regulation, which specifies the limits for contaminants in every product category that has been assessed. This is a regulation that's been enforced for many years. However, there's regular updates, and every update goes back to the same one, so it's kind of easier because then you keep the same reference. I picked up on the next slides a couple of the contaminants categories that actually they're either being reviewed or they're quite hot topics within the European Union regulatory framework. Mycotoxins is always been a topic of discussion. Prevalence is expected to rise due to environmental changes. This is something that happens everywhere in the world. This is something that even within Europe, we have seen a big difference from prevalence from South to North Europe, and generally occurrence keeps increasing in crops to Central and North Europe. At the moment, any changes in economical, political, and changes in trade and impact affects the risk assessment, and the European Union always keeps the risk assessment as a live and advises member states as to where to sample and where to focus the testing. And there is ongoing work for the European Food Safety Authority to also look and assess limits for the metabolites of the mycotoxins. In fact, Wanda will talk later about sustainability, and one report that the EU published yesterday, I think, on the toxicological effect of the mycotoxins is a review of some of the limits potentially to increase the allowed limits, because to counteract the amount of waste they produce in food or crops that they deem not to be safe for consumption within Europe. Another area of great interest, and actually one with finally having regulatory limits being enforced 1st of July this year, so in just over 5-6 weeks, is pyridine alkaloids. Many times these are confused with mycotoxins. They're not. These are natural toxins. The plant toxins, and it's part of the defense mechanism of the plant. Usually they enter the food chain through contamination in the crops when there's a lot of, you get wheat, very, very high on pH. The regulatory limits that are going to be applied, they're applicable to tea infusions, and dried herbs, and any similar category. And they're all about total pH at the moment. We're not looking at the separate substances. So these are the ones that they were decided about 2 years ago, and they've been applied from 1st of July. Another area that gets a lot of publicity, especially with increasing industrialization in agricultural countries, is the persistent organic pollutants. It's a very, very wide category. Some of them were very well known and studied, like DDT and other pesticides. And also we have dioxins, furans, and PCBs. The problem with these is that they take very, very long time to metabolize. Actually, they don't break down, and they enter the food supply chain through water and through the soil. Out of the persistent organic pollutants, PFAs are the ones that we had recently a bit of a crisis within Europe, and they started a review on the levels. And this happened from pretty much disturbing the land close to the landfill, try to convert it to agricultural land, and then they start detecting high levels of PFAS, which are breakdown compounds and plasticizers that go into food. There's a current draft regulation that will drop the limits for baby food and ingredients that go into the baby food to very, very low, 0.001 milligrams per kilogram, which is about 100 times lower than what was previously proposed. There's no timeline at the moment as to where we're going to have some set limits. Everything is under discussion. And then we move into pesticides. So within the European Union framework, pesticides is a very broad term. It covers everything from fungicides and pesticides and growth regulators. And it's basically, it just covers all the chemicals that prevents or destroys or controls harmful organisms. Also, we have the plant protection, chemicals, and inactive standards, which actually is a formulation that has a desired effect. The 4 stages of approval of pesticides within Europe, you have the risk assessment data that can take anything from a year to several years and several discussions. After that, then based on the risk assessment, you have the setting the maximum residue limits, then it's the enforcement and control. There's always a grace period between setting the limits and actually apply them and enforce them. And it's quite important to know that although the European Union will adopt a grace period, this period is not necessarily adopted exactly on the same period in every member state. They can decide to have their own grace period there. And for non-EU imported crops, there's MRS can be requested, setting of MRS can be requested at the exporting country. The regulatory framework for pesticides, again, is split into 2. You have the regulation for the plant protection products to be placed in the market, and also you have the regulation that covers all the sets of the MRS for the various products and categories of those. Recently, well not so recently, but about 18 months ago, we're still working with that. It's very important to understand the difference and the applicability of European Union law to the United Kingdom at the moment. And this is not really very, very clear. And basically, when you look at the United Kingdom, the Northern Ireland is part of it, but in Northern Ireland, European Union law applies. So if you plan to export products there, then this is exactly as any other EU country. However, If you're about to export to Scotland, England or Wales, at the moment, up to the end of last year, all the EU regulation was copy-pasted into British law. And so far, we're only about 6 months into the new year, the regulation is vastly still the same. We have seen some changes. We know there are a couple of formulations that were approved in England, that they're not approved in the EU, and also they're not approved in Northern Ireland. So it's very, very important to be quite clear now which is the country of destination, because that can create a bit of a problem. If I want to be maybe a bit conservative, I would take an estimate and say that for the time being and the foreseeable future, if a product complies with the European Union limits, then it's very, very likely that it's compliant with the UK limits. We don't have any indication as to where more approvals will start changing. There is absolutely no timeline on that, and probably they're taking on it case by case. Pesticides database, I saw Carolina also had a similar screenshot. This is where you can get most of the up-to-date information, and actually when you get what's happening with updates on approvals and limits within the European Union. There's two topics within pesticides in the European Union. One is the glyphosate. The current approval expires about mid-December this year. The reassessment started about 3 years ago. The process was well set and it had a timeline. However, it's a very, very hotly political topic. It's very debated. There's a lot of consumer organizations that debate that. There's a lot of NGOs and a lot of retail consortiums that had an opinion on the consultation. That meant that in order to review and respond to everyone, all the approval and the assessment was pushed back quite significantly. The current estimate is to have an assessment at this quarter and then publish everything in July 2023. I won't really be surprised if this gets pushed back a bit later than that. Nevertheless, the EU published the monitoring program from 2021, so usually there's about a 12-month lag on that. And this is just really an overview of the situation of the previous year. There's not really much surprise there on pesticides at a national level. And this kind of overall non-compliance rate, which based on every member country having its own risk assessment, going to the supermarket, sampling the products, and then correlating back to the country. When you have the non-compliance rate, about 16%, this is pretty much, it's been stable for many years. On the other hand though, we have the rapid alert system, which is, these are notifications on the borders. And this could lead to product recalls, could lead to a warning, or could lead to a further investigation. This is coordinated by other EU members. The kind of summary report takes a long time to be published, but I have some data to present. This is the situation specifically to Peru for the last 15 months, more or less. No surprises there. At the moment, you can see that the category covers everything like pesticides, mycotoxins, heavy metals, and so on. I have to say that the slides here, they're a bit out of date. I did them about, I think, 3-4 weeks ago. If I take the data from last week, actually heavy metals will be on the top because there were 2 avocado warnings with cadmium in the last week, and there was a organic cocoa warning with cadmium as well. There was another food additive, again with cadmium, that it was notified within the EU. So these metals will probably be on the top, around 6 to 7. And the top on the list is avocado, and primarily is cadmium. This is from the report of 2020. As I said, there's a big lag on data. It takes a lot of time, and I think COVID delayed even more the publication of the reviews. So what you see here is how the hazards are classified within the European Union. And on the right side there, you have hazards from within the member countries, which typically, like pathogens on the top, is usually the biggest category. And on the other side, you have the hazards that originated from non-member countries. What you see on the non-member countries, you see pesticides on the top, and this is very, very unusual distribution for 2020. Normally, you would see microbiological factors on the top, similar to within EU, then you will see mycotoxins, and then you will see pesticides. And that brings us to a big issue within European Union the last couple of years, which is ethylene oxide, that actually has skewed all the recalls and all the data from any other compound. You see, if I take ethylene oxide out, aflatoxins remains a prevalent product recall, chemistry-related factor. Ethylene oxide notifications were up to about 500% within 2020. By far, the most prevalent from any other pesticides. 500% sounds a lot. It is 166 notifications, but also goes back to generally the fact that pesticides notification from exporting countries into the EU, they're generally quite low. And that led to a lot of issues and a lot of investigations after that. And it says to carry on. So what is ethylene oxide? It's banned in the EU, it's a fumigant, as you already know. It usually comes into the product from what we found so far, probably from not proper aeration or cross-contamination of the packaging materials. Testing can be done for either residue and metabolite, and I think Carolina earlier focused a lot about making sure you also monitor the metabolites in the analysis, otherwise the certificate is not complete and is not compliant, and that's very, very critical for ethylene oxide because it's not a stable substance. So anybody who tests for that need to be able to see the degradation products to be compliant with the European law. There's a couple of methods around. Whichever method you choose, it's fine to use. But sometimes if you can identify the metabolite, it will help you to do an investigation and understand what the source of contamination was. That's the timeline. I mentioned that we had the first alerts in 2020. Then the situation increased. It started from sesame seeds from India, then in Belgium, then France, then Germany. In October 2020, there was an emergency meeting because we could start seed spreading across several countries within the EU. And then what we saw in 2021, we started having many other products. And some of the products being very, very complicated to test because apart from seeds, dried vegetables and dried herbs, we started having beans that they use for emulsifiers and stabilizers in the final product. And this is the most complex area because then we started seeing ethylene oxide in things like ice cream, in things like cakes, in various desserts, dried soups, dried noodles, and any ready-to-eat products. And that caused a record amount of alerts within 3 months. We think this issue is here to stay. We can see using SGS horizon scanning database that actually it gets a lot of mentions online. That's always a way to monitor trends because if people talk about it, there's probably an issue. And only for the first 5 months of this year, there have been 750 notifications on ethylene oxide. It's fairly safe to say that by the end of the year, there will be more than 1,000 notifications. And at the moment, the authorities in every country under high alert, and they're doing targeted testing in products that can be treated with ethylene oxide. And moving on to the US, a quick recap. The facility needs a registration with the FDA and also needs an import agent. The FISMA FSBP applies to all farms since January 2020. Specific product standards and ingredient requirements are applicable, and you have categories like juices or canned meat. The food contact material requirements are enforced, and also there's included an animal drug approval that's required. The US FDA importing food products is applicable generally for the US airports. The FISMA Food Safety Modernization Act includes several parameters preventive, but primarily the main scope is to ensure that the product is safe to use. And it's focused on prevention of food safety issues, and also it kind of covers the entire food chain, the entire food system. It defines sorts of microbiological contamination primarily. This is no news to anyone who's involved in this area, but it's quite interesting that it's breaking it down by category. Then you have the US labeling law. There's a new fact panel, and that has different effective dates. It manufactures is applicable to different products, and it's very important on the country of origin compliance that if the country of origin is mentioned on the master container and it follows all the documentation down to the retailer, so it means that the chain of custody is not broken, it's much more traceable and compliance can be much easier being monitored. Once this is moved, then the retailers must notify the customer for the country of origin, and that can kind of create an area cause some significant issues. And of course, on top of that, we have the specific proponent in California, which there could be a label that says that consuming a specific product may actually expose you to chemicals that can cause potential harm. So who is doing what when importing in the US? You have the customs that they will check the country of origin labeling and the relevant regulation, and then you have the forestry entities that they will check animal products and food and farm products. Then for specific product control, there's several categories that goes from food and beverages to forestry to tobacco and so on, and it depends on the products that need to be imported. So prerequisites to export to the US, you must have a registered broker. It's one of the key differences with importing to EU. Only electronic filing is allowed. Origin labeling must be in compliance with CFR regulation, and FDA requires an FDA registration. So what does the FDA does? It's covering items for products that are not covered from the other agencies. Therefore, that's what you have to be registered with them, and you must have an import agent. And then we must provide prior notice of shipment into the US, and the FISMA facility needs to be compliant either with FISMA or farm compliance for product safety. And then you have the FISMA import compliance that also must be maintained. And one of those SGS is a third-party certification accredited program. Last point on the food contaminants and how possibly can enter the food supply chain is actually through food authenticity. This is very, very critical because as a producer, as any part of the supply chain, you can ensure that your raw ingredients are fit for purpose, fit for consumption, but then the more complex the supply chain, the more risk you may have. And when you have situations where you have substitution, you have dilution, you have adding baking powders and so on, apart from the financial fraud, then you introduce additional risks to the supply chain. We don't need to go as far as thinking about melamine and any baking powders or illegal dyes in spices. It can happen even if you mix cereals and crops with cheaper varieties because they could have a higher mycotoxin content and so on, and also undeclared allergens, which is a big issue within the European Union. So it's worth always considering the food fraud and what's happening on the supply chain when you maintain your traceability. And that was really the kind of last slide, just about on time, which is really good. This is the areas we can help you as SGS with testing and also giving advice, labeling, compliance and auditing. And the final slide for me is just an overview of our horizon scanning food safety database that you can see regulations coming as real time as possible. And also that's where we're working with major food retailers and suppliers to monitor trends and create tailor-made programs for that. And with this, I think we can take any questions. I have to change the headphone.